constructor. And what's the first line inside the constructor always? Super, right? Because it still has to do all the normal React setup stuff. And then I can go ahead and initialize my state, which is just an object. And I'm going to make a property called show comments because it's going to tell me whether I should show the comments or not. Now, should that be true or false by default? Probably false, right? Makes sense to me. And then we're going to need our, what do we call the click handler? Toggle comments. So we're going to need to make a method called toggle comments. Is that going to take any arguments? Event, right. It's an event handler. We're going to need to do that. So that's probably a good idea. Because what type of thing is this? Oh, I guess I put it on the span. It should probably be on the link, right? I want the whole thing to be clickable. So this is an A tag, right? What happens if you click on an A tag? Right, it goes somewhere, right? Do we actually want to go anywhere? We do not. So how do we prevent it from doing the thing it normally does? Prevent default. Nope, it's a method call. So that will keep it from going anywhere. Now, let's console log. See what happens. So this, when we're console logging this, is null. And why is it null? Any ideas? Right. So we're invoking it on a click event, right? And we know in React, because we looked at the events yesterday, they're actually proxy events that kind of wrap the original events. And so if we just call it, the context is essentially nothing because it made its own thing. So we need to bind it. There's a couple ways to do that, if you recall from yesterday. We could do an arrow function. The way I did it, just so you're kind of doing them, we'll just do in the constructor. We'll just go ahead and bind it. I think today we'll probably get into the third way to do this, which is probably the way that Davey and I prefer to do it, but for now, we'll just do it this way because you've already seen it. So now if I do that, what is this? This is now the actual component, which is great, our article component, right? All right, so with prevented default, what do we want to actually happen when we toggle comments? Text box, right? And that text box is going to show when what is true. Right. So we need to change show comments to be true, right? And to do that, we're going to have to change state. What's the method we call the change state? Yep. I can call this .set state. And that's just going to take an object. And so we want show comments to be the opposite of whatever it currently is, right? because our method's called toggle comments. So if it's true, I want it to be false. If it's false, I want it to be true. So I want show comments to be not this dot state dot show comments. Make sense? Now, one thing that's a little tricky initially about set state is it is not synchronous. Has anybody done any asynchronous programming at all? So synchronous means everything just happens in the order that you define it. So like in a method, ev.prevents_default runs immediately before set state. And then that'll run immediately before anything else I put after here. Makes sense, right? We're just reading top to bottom. There are asynchronous functions, like for instance, if I make a call to an external website to get data from it, if we did that synchronously, that means you would have to wait for that remote server to respond before it could go to the next line, right? So JavaScript does a lot of things asynchronously. It's like, hey, I'm going to make this call to the other server, but I'm going to keep doing the next thing while we wait for that to come back. So that's asynchronously. So you might move to the next line before it actually has the data back. So if you don't account for that, then you might be trying to use data that you're going to get from the server, but it doesn't have it yet. So it's going to have all these undefined things. So set state is actually like that too. It does it asynchronously. I'm not sure what exactly React is looking for internally for when it actually runs it, but it can accumulate all these changes and then set state at a later time. Yeah.
So is asynchronous programming like done for using
Promises or observables, there's lots of different ways to handle it. Promises is probably the most common. If you're not familiar with promises, we'll get into that more when we do API calls, but it's basically saying, hey, I'm going to make this call, and then I promise to run the next thing when I actually get that data. So it's kind of a nice name for it because it makes sense in the context. But yeah, so if I do synchronously console log this dot state here, we're probably going to get not the value we expect because this is going to run immediately after it runs this line, but it hasn't actually set state yet. So let's see what happens. So you can see, even though I clicked it, show comments is still false because we just ran this thing and it immediately went to the next line, even though this part's still waiting around to execute. So if you want to see the actual value of set state, it can take a second argument. So the first argument is whatever object you give it. And then the second argument is whatever is going to run after set state has actually happened. So if instead I put my console log here, so now I'm passing it an anonymous function that's going to run after it's actually set state, then it should have the right value. Make sense? Kind of. I'm not going to lie. When I first started JavaScript, it took a long time to get my head around asynchronous stuff. So I do not blame you if that's not 100% clear. But we'll deal with it a lot. So hopefully by the end of this thing, you'll understand it and be able to use it. So just know, because like even when I first started React, I did not know that was an asynchronous function. It's kind of hard to find out that it is, and I could not figure out why my state was not what I expected it to be when I was trying to console log it to make sure I was doing the right thing. So I just want to kind of save you that headache. If you are console logging it immediately after set state, do it as the second callback to that function, because otherwise it may not be what you expect. And you might not have actually done anything wrong. It's just not updated yet. All right. So now we know that's working because it did show the true false. So now if we can set that to true, how do we get something to essentially conditionally render? Yeah. Yeah, you could use an if statement. So just say if that's true, then render this, right? Because remember, React is not super complicated. It's just JavaScript, so we can use those curly braces anywhere to do actual JavaScript stuff. So we could do the curly braces and say, if show comments, or if this dot state that show comments, then return a comment box, basically. I'm going to show you a slightly different way. Is anybody familiar with the ternary operator from other languages, perhaps? A few. It's pretty common to use it in React, because basically what a ternary operator does is the first thing you give it is a condition, and then the second thing is what it's going to do if that condition is true, and then the third thing is what it's going to do if that condition is false. So it's a pretty concise way to be able to do like an if-else. So we're just going to do that real quick. So below my two links here, I'm going to do curly braces and do this .state.show comments. And so a ternary is whatever's going to evaluate to a Boolean followed by a question mark. And then the next thing is whatever you want it to do if that true. So I'm going to say comments enabled. And then a colon, and then whatever you want it to do if that's not true, in which case I don't want it to do anything. So I'm just going to say null. So I always think of it like this .state.show comments, give me a div. If not that, then give me null. So kind of read it like a question, and then it makes sense. And now, oh, look at that. Enabled, disabled, enabled, disabled. So much fun. All right, so rather than just a div that says comments enabled, let's have it actually like show a text box. So let's make an actual component for that that we just call comments. New file. Import that, make a new class for comments. And before we forget, export it. I should probably do a commit. I haven't done one for a while. Oh, we did a lot of things. All right. So in our render, we just want a text box, right? So we can just return text area. Oh, not curly braces, parentheses. And then just need to import it here. Let's see what happens. Ta-da! Cool, right? And then if I click it again, it should go away. All right. So we got that. What else do we probably need to be able to actually submit a comment? Some kind of submit button. Good idea. So easy enough. We'll just put a div around everything, because remember, in React, everything has to be a child of a single div. So we can do text area. Probably be nice and put a placeholder in here. Just something so they know what that box is there for. Enter a comment. And then we'll just give them, we're not going to enforce this, but we could if we want to. We'll just tell them not to talk forever. We'll give them 1,000 character max. And then, a button, we'll just use a normal foundation class because we got foundation in this project. So it styles it as a button and say submit comment. Ta-da. All right. So how do we keep track of what somebody has actually typed in that box? Let's talk a little bit broader terms. So we're going to need some state, right? Because we're going to need to keep track of the comment. And when they click that button to submit the comment, we need to take whatever was in that comment and add it to like a comments array, right? So then we can map over that and render them. So just thinking about a big picture, that's kind of what we need to accomplish. So at any given time, we need to know what the actual content of that comments box is. So how do we do that? There was a way we did it yesterday with Davey in the reactor bats. Remember how we kept track of what was in that input? I know we covered a lot of new things yesterday, so maybe you don't recall. But we did it with a reference, remember? We made a reference on the input, so that way we could just get the value out of it at any time. So that's one way to do it. We're going to do it a slightly different way today, which is probably more the typical way to do it in React, which is what they call a bound input. So what we're going to do is actually bind what is in this text area with something on our state. So the comments component itself is going to keep track of its own state, and so it's concerned with both what's in the comment box and then what list of comments it already has. So let's go ahead and set up state for this. So for starters, so when we start out, what's the content of our comment? Nothing, basically, right? So just empty string. And then, how do we get that value here? Well, React has a pretty easy way to do that. You just tell it the value equals this .state.comment. Easy enough. So now we got our nice placeholder, but I can't change anything. Why can't I change anything when I type? I think there might actually be a warning. No, there's not for that. That's disappointing. But why can't I change the value? Right, because I set the value to an empty string, so it's like I don't care what you're typing anymore. This is the value, and it's an empty string, and that's what it's going to be. So we need to do something to handle when we change it, right? So you can do onChange is another event you can tie into. And we're just going to do, so we're going to do that to call a method this .handleChange. And to get it bound correctly, don't forget to bind it in your constructor. And then we're going to need a handleChange method, right? So to make sure this is working, we could initially just I think this will work. Let's find out. Yeah. So it enters it, but then it gets set immediately back to an empty string. So we can see that we're entering stuff, but then we haven't actually changed state, so it just gets set back to an empty string. So it never actually shows up in the text box. So what we want it to do is once I enter a letter, we don't want it to be an empty string anymore, right? So I have to set state to be the new value. So if instead of console logging, I set state, say comment is the event target value. Think it'll work? Maybe. You look dubious. Oh, it does work. Excellent. And just to prove that it's actually changing state, we can do our same thing, pass it an anonymous function, and console log this dot state dot comment. Give it a second to rebuild. There we go. That's what we expect to happen. So now, at any given time, we have a completely updated version of that comment in our state, right? So that's good. So whenever I hit this submit button, then all we have to do is take what's in the comment, this.state.comment, and push it onto an array, right? We'll basically store it that way. So that means what else do we need in our state? Right, a comments array, which we will initialize as just empty. Take that back out. And so we want that to happen when we click the button, right? So what do I need on the button? An on-click handler? Yep. And we'll just call it add comment. That makes sense, right? We can add it to the list of things that we have bound. And then we can make the actual function. All right, so what do I need to have happen when that button is clicked? Kind of mentioned it or briefly a couple times. Yeah, perfect. So we need to take whatever is currently this.state.comment. Since we're updating that every time you push a key, every time there's a change, that means at any given time, we know exactly what's in there. We're going to take that string and push it onto the comments array. And then you even talked about the nice part of it. We can reset comments back to an empty string, or comment back to an empty string, so that way it clears the field back. Good choices. All right, so first thing, since we're changing more than one item now, rather than just doing this, let's make a copy of state first. So let's say use our destructuring assignment. So it's basically just saying make a new variable state that's an object and take all the properties that are currently in this .state and copy them over to the new object. So now I have a full copy of state, but I'm not manipulating the actual state object. So that lets me make these changes and then just call this .set state with it, and that'll give the updated version of state. So we can say, actually, let's be a little nice. Let's make a comment an object. Because a lot of times when you look at comments, what do you see? You see not just the text, but what other kind of information? Yeah. Person's name. We don't have users, so we're kind of going to skip that one. What's another thing that's on there? Yeah, so like when it was submitted. So we can do that, even though we don't have users. So we could say the text. What's the text equal to? Yep. So we already have it in state, so we can just say that. And then time. I'm going to say, you might not have dealt with this in JavaScript before, but it does have its own date class. You can just say new date, and that'll give you a current timestamp, essentially. Yeah. You could, yeah, in this particular case, since you just copied it. So the question was, do you have to do this.state.comment? Could you just use state.comment? Yeah, probably. Because we just assigned all those properties to the same object. And then, now that we have the new comment object, we need to push it onto the array, right? So, I'm just going to do state.comments.push, our comment object that we just made. And then, you said you wanted to clear out the input box, right? Let me see here. So, how do I do that? You could do that. But remember, it's already bound to our state of our comment. So it's probably easier just to set that back to an empty string. So we can just say state. Remember, state is our copy of this.state. So we can just say that now equals an empty string. And then, now that our copy of state has all the updated values that we want, then we just set our actual state to our copy. So we're just going to essentially overwrite our existing copy of state with our new copy. So you can just say set state to my new state. Make sense? Let's see how that works. And actually, let's go ahead and do our customary thing of console logging our state afterwards and make sure it looks the way we expect. Typey, typey, typey. Submit. You can see it cleared out that. It's set back to an empty string. And we're going to have one item in our comments array, which is an object with that text, and then a timestamp on it. Hooray. Good job, everyone. So last little thing to do. It'd be nice if when we submit that comment, it actually shows up. That'd be cool. Super mega bonus credit hyperfighting. So we can just do, right? So now we have an array of objects. We've rendered those before. So we can do the exact same thing, right? So right below the button, where are comments living right now? What are we going to map over to make these? The comments array, which lives on, they're stored in state. We don't need a copy of state. We're actually, because this is just presenting them to the user, so we just actually want to take whatever's in state. So whatever's in our comments array in state and just map over it, right? And make a new whatever for each one that shows the text of it. So if we do this .state.comments.map, and then we'll remember to do the key right off the bat this time, so we'll pass it the comment and the index. And let's just do div. We'll just give it a class. And another div inside that. And inside we're just going to say comment.text, right? Because on our comment object, the text property has the actual string. And then let's not forget to put our key on here. And let's see what happens. Ta-da! Super cool. So, remember what we did in the other part for the links? What could we make this? Anybody remember what it was called? Functional stateless component. Because this particular part is purely presentational, right? It has no state of its own. So, we could just make a prop or a comment function that takes props. And basically, just take that, put it there. And instead of so then what does this function return instead of that markup? We just made a new component, right? So we can just call that component. And so it gets the key now. Don't need that there. And then what do we need to pass into it so it knows how to render it? It's got to know the comment, right? Just pass in the comment as prop. Cool, cool. What am I missing here? Key comment. Oh, my closing curly brace. There we go. And then this just becomes props.comment.text because we just passed it in as a prop, right? So theoretically, that should still work. Cool, cool. And then, just for styling, since that doesn't look real pretty, let's make a comment CSS import the style sheet in our component. And I'm just going to copy paste these. I want to get you guys your break here shortly. But basically, we'll go over them real quick. It would be nice if we had a little top margin, right? So it's not stuck right on there. It'd be nice if this button matched the other ones, probably. The blue one definitely sticks out. And it would also be nice if there was something that kind of separated our comments down here, because right now it just looks like a bunch of words. So, apply some margin top to the div as a whole. Change the background color and the hover color of the button to match those golds that we use. Put some padding on the content div, give it a border, so that way it's kind of visually separated. On the very first one of type, I don't think we've used the selector, first of type. So it basically means the first child of that particular type. So if you look at our markup for comments, if I just use first child, the first child of this div is going to be what? What's the very first child of this div? The text area, right? So that rule won't apply to this. But this is the first of type. It's the first div that's of this div. So that rule works. So basically giving the top borders a little curve. Last child, giving them bottom borders a little curve. And where'd that come from? And then nth child, that's a fun one too. So basically, you can tell it which number of child, or you can just give it even or odd as an argument. And so basically, we're going to alternate the background color slightly so you can easily visually differentiate it. So if I save that, let it reload. Oh, there you go. So fancy. Why didn't it change my button color? There we go. Hooray. Yes.
For showing the date, is it just comment time, or do you have to do something?
So you'll actually have to like format that, which is why I didn't do it right this second. Yeah. Formatting dates is not the funnest thing in the world and not particularly relevant to the current discussion, so I left that off. But yeah, it would be nice to have a nicely formatted date at the top of each of those. But yeah, I leave that as an exercise for the reader. Any other questions? Feel good about everything we did this morning? Awesome. Let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll do new stuff. Yeah. Yes.